Everyone, and welcome to PhD Defense. Thank you all for being here. In a nutshell, my project is to show why following rules is important for human beings, especially for interpersonal coordination, by discussing the role of norms in music performance at the levels of motivation, the levels of planning, and at the level of problem solving. Let's think about this first bullet for a moment. Why do we, as human beings, feel the need to follow rules? I mean, we may have personal standards for how we think human beings should be, how persons should be, how the world should be, and these standards help us form rules for how to behave in different situations. But we may also sometimes find ourselves submitting to arbitrary rules. For instance, artists may sometimes submit to a set of rules in order to stimulate a decision. The Dogma 95 movement within the movie world is a good example of this. And finally, which is what my project is mainly about, rules are also important for coordination. A good example is, of course, the rules of traffic and rules of laws of government. But intuitively, a lot of people will think that the rules that are important for coordination only really work if everybody in the community is following the same rules. But actually, we don't necessarily need agreement of the same rules for rules to be efficient. And my point is that by looking at a music ensemble, this is one of the things that we can show, even when musicians disagree regarding the nature of the rules that govern the situation, they are still able to reach coordination exactly because they can calibrate between each other and can calibrate between each other's expectations for which rules the other musicians are following. In short, I think that by looking at music performances, we can highlight how following rules broadly conceived is important and to a great extent necessary for virtually all levels of decisions in a situation, in the performance in this case. And I don't have much time here, but I would nevertheless like to treat you to a short example. In 2004, I gave a performance with the Youth Symphony Orchestra in the town hall of Odense, and we played Dvorak's 9th Symphony, and in the 4th movement of this symphony there is what I would call a virtual accelerando, meaning that Dvorak uses a build-up from slow note values to fast ones, thereby generating the illusion of the tempo going faster. And this is what it's supposed to sound like, or can sound like, if a professional orchestra plays it. Okay, so what happened when my orchestra played this was that the strings were actually accelerating, thereby prompting the conductor to try and conduct a slower tempo on top of what we were playing in order to try and slow us down. Unfortunately, when the horn section or the brass section looked up for their cue, they simply took this exaggerated slow tempo that the conductor was using, and this is what that sounded like. What is interesting here, I think, is a number of things. First, contrary to what some people seem to think, a conductor is not all-powerful. He does not control all aspects of the performance. Sometimes he has to adjust to what the musicians are doing just as much as the musicians try to adjust to him, or to put it in the words of Marilyn Fisher and Isaiah Jackson, a rehearsal or concert can be understood as a complex series of adjustments based on mutual responsiveness among those on stage. Secondly, although symphony orchestras and music ensembles in general have infrastructures, for example, a more or less explicit hierarchy determining who to follow in this or that situation, these infrastructures can always be challenged by what individual musicians want to do in the performance. And in the previous examples, we have the violins and the strings in general wanting to stick to their flow for as long as possible until the brass section forces them to comply with a new tempo, for instance. And thirdly, this example also shows that there are more factors affecting musicians at once in such a situation. And I think it's interesting to see in this situation that musicians actually do take action. They don't just stop in the face of error. And I think this is a relevant point because within music philosophy, particularly within the discussion of the ontology of musical works and on how to properly classify a performance as being of a work, there has been the idea that there is some sort of minimum amount of features that a performance must have in order to be of a particular work. Nelson Goodman, for instance, had the idea that, or held that the performance must be in perfect compliance with the score of the piece in order to be of that piece. Stephen Davies had a slightly more, or has a slightly more soft version of this, because he holds that there has to be a certain amount of features which the performance has in common, or rather that there's a minimum amount of features that the performance must have in common in order with the score in order to be of that work. But in both cases, whether we're talking about exact compliance with the score or we're talking about what Davies calls the threshold that separates the non-performance from the performance, if we consider these criteria, it seems that they don't quite rhyme with how musicians work when they are performing on stage, because it's almost no matter how badly the performance goes, the musicians will still try to carry on and try to save the rest of the performance. And in fact, I try to build my own criterion for compliance with the composition on this fact that, namely, that the musicians have an intention to play a particular work, and I try to make that the central of the definition. But back to the question here, how do musicians decide in such a coordination problem? What guides their decisions? Well, one intuitive answer may be to say, well, the musicians have built routines. They know that, well, when I reach this point, then I'll do this, and if I get in this situation, then I'll do this, and so on. And a lot of these routines may be internalized, or more broadly speaking, norms of the performance context may become internalized, something that I do automatically through rehearsal and through years of practice. If we're talking more general norms, they become internalized in the sense that it becomes something that I just do in the situation without thinking too much about it. But what coordination problems like the one I exemplified before shows is that musicians sometimes have to make a choice. For instance, if we have an example where where two or more musicians are not perfectly synchronized, then a musician may often have to make a choice as to who to follow in the situation. And such a choice is informed by norms or rules in the situation. And I say that these norms are prioritized because in the situation there will be some norms that are considered more important by the musician than others, such that if a musician reaches a point where he realizes that he can't fulfill all the rules inherent in the composition, then he must make a choice as to, okay, what is more important for me to save in this situation? So the norms of the performance context are prioritized. So we have several factors here that affect the decisions of the musician. So let's take a look at how these relate to each other. First, we're talking about routines affecting action. We're talking about internalized norms that could also affect action directly. And a further point I'd like to stress is that routines can also have steps that are internalized, such that a routine may consist of large chunks of internalized behavioral patterns. We can also have an action that's the direct effect of a choice. A choice may also affect a routine, so that, for instance, in a situation I may think, okay, should I do as I did in that performance the other day, or should I do like we did in that concert some years ago? And by this choice I affect either one or the other of a set of routines. And finally, these choices are influenced by norms for the performance context I'm in. And these norms may be very specific as they are in a composition-based performance, and they may be more general if we're talking an improvised performance within a given genre. But in all cases, I have norms that affect my choices. And if anyone by now thinks to themselves, well, hey, isn't that an awful lot like how we behave according to norms in general, regardless of whether we're playing music or not, then you have actually already understood a vital part of my dissertation. So, this project has a number of sub-projects that I will not have, unfortunately not have enough time to go into in detail, but I would nevertheless like to sketch these sub-projects very briefly. One sub-project is to discuss the role of compositions and, to some extent, genre conventions as sets of rules. That is, I want to look at what affects the musician's decisions in a performance context, and how may these influences be described in terms of rules. Another sub-project is to highlight the fact that such rules are always conceived of alongside a priority ranking. That was what I was briefly talking about before, that the musician ranks the different rules that he has to follow in the situation according to some sort of priority ranking, or what is more or less important for the musician. And one of my points is that that these priority rankings may be described simply or may be identified with what we know as interpretation. That the very act of interpreting a piece of music may actually amount to giving priority to different rules in the performance context or in the composition. And yet another sub-project is to show by means of formal method that norms for the performance context must be taken into account by the musician striving for coordination, or it should be stressed that they must be taken into account by the musician striving for coordination. Now, I will briefly describe my main points regarding the two first bullets here, and then I'll return to the last one at the end of my presentation.